Record on this computer. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Adriana DeFazio. I'll be our host for tonight's session. If you haven't been here before or joined us, I'd like to welcome you to our online live weekly Dharma gatherings. Tonight, our session will be led by our teacher, David Kahane. And we'll start off with a guided meditation, a talk, and then end with a Q&A discussion. So a little bit about our teacher. David is a political theorist at the University of Alberta, where he teaches and researches democracy, power, public participation, and systems change. From 2010 to 2016, he led Alberta Climate Dialogue, an international project that convenes citizens to deliberate on climate change and influence climate policy. He recently stepped down as Shastri for Edmonton, and prior to that was a director of the Edmonton Shambhala Center. He lives with his son Solomon, and they tend a permaculture food forests in the Edmonton River Valley. The title for tonight's talk is Climate Change as Charnel Ground. Before we jump into the talk itself, I'd love to just quickly explain for this Zoom platform, for any type of participation, questions you might have, or discussion, there's a raise hand feature in the right-hand side panel of your screen. If you have a question or want to contribute in any way, you can raise your hand clicking on your name. And then what will happen is I'll choose you, highlight you as a speaker, and bring you onto screen. A reminder that all these talks are recorded, so if you'd prefer not to have your face showing in any way, make sure to stop your video. Other than that, I think that's it on my end, and I'll give the floor to our teacher, David. David, thank you so much. David, I think your mic isn't on.
Is that better?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. I could have given the whole talk muted. That might have been better. So just to say, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be in this series. I've listened to a number of the talks that have gone before, and just a great group of people. Before we begin guided meditation, I thought I'd just say a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from with this. As was just mentioned, I resigned as Shastri for Edmonton very recently, and in fact, as best I can tell, have stepped away from the Shambhala community. And so it was very poignant putting this talk together. Maybe the last talk I'll give in Shambhala, maybe not. Packing up my practice materials this week and some of my Dharma texts. So on the one hand, in putting this talk together, I was really drawing on these rich sources from Shambhala that have nourished me for 10 or 12 years. And on the other hand, there were moments that perhaps some of you can identify with where I found a word in my mouth that didn't feel quite right. And for me, in a sense, this is the topic of the talk. How do we relate to difficult truths? But I felt some of the language of Shambhala being used in ways that did not feel like facing up directly to difficult truths. And so it's just been bittersweet. And I'll say as well, I'm a white, cis, straight, middle-class man offering this talk, and that, as will come out in the talk, inflects what I'm able to see and not see. So I'm very interested to hear from others in this live context, and perhaps hear from others in other electronic ways as other folks listen to this. So let's explore together. And maybe before we meditate, the last thing I'll say is I genuinely don't take this talk to be coming from a place of great attainment or wisdom, but rather just an inquiry that I'll hope you'll join, and we can be in a space of perhaps not knowing together. And so let's do a guided meditation. I thought that we could do this as a contemplation on some of the difficult truths of climate disruption. And so we'll settle, and I'll offer a little bit of reminder about entering into simple meditation. And then many of you have probably done this contemplation technique, perhaps in a Shambhala context before, but at a certain point in the meditation, I will offer a phrase or a question. And the invitation is you could really turn your mind to that question. You might imagine something and explore that image. You might seize on a word and chew on it. You might use your critical intelligence. So we actually use our minds with the phrase. And then what typically happens is as we contemplate, at a certain point, some feeling or sensation or energy will arise. We'll notice something coming up. And at that point, you're invited to let go of the phrase, let go of the image, and be as best you can with that feeling, with curiosity and gentleness. And often it's quite interesting or illuminating to leave words aside and be with whatever feeling has been provoked. I'll just say two other things about contemplation. One is, insofar as some feeling does arise, there's no right feeling. And so the feeling might be sadness or joy or boredom or excitement. The feeling could also just be blank, empty. And the invitation is just feel into that feeling of blank, empty. What's there? You might discover something. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that in all of our practices, including this contemplation, self-care is paramount. So maybe out of trauma, or maybe out of having been face to face with climate impacts yourself, or maybe just because you had a really rough day, you might notice at a certain point that this is feeling like too much, or the contemplation or some other part of the talk just doesn't feel safe for you. And at that point, I really invite you to go back to meditation. If even hearing the prompts is too much, you could turn down the volume. And at a certain point, if your volume's down, you'll see me get animated and talky again, and you could tune back in at that point. So let's begin with meditation. We could take a good posture, dignified, relaxed. Could meditate with eyes open or eyes closed. And so you could begin just by feeling your body sitting, your toes and feet, your ankles, calves, your knees, thighs, pelvis, belly, back and sides, chest, neck, jaw, face, scalp, tuning in to the ordinary sensations of your body. And then you could place your mind in particular on the feeling of your body breathing. Whatever sensations are vivid in an ordinary breath. And as you sit feeling your breath, emotions may arise, sensations, energy, thoughts. We don't need to push anything away. Just coming back again and again to the feeling of your body breathing. I'd invite you to contemplate something you've noticed in your own life that points to climate change. It could be something about weather patterns or seasons or plants or more ice on the sidewalks or something else. Just call something to mind and notice what feeling or energy arises in you when you contemplate this everyday sign of climate change. Letting yourself feel whatever energy or emotion or sensation arises. And now I'd invite you to call to mind a particular extreme weather event that you've experienced or just known and heard about. It could be flooding, fire season, destructive rains or winds. Bring to mind images, sounds, voices associated with that event. And feel into whatever arises as you contemplate it. Now I invite you to call to mind people who are on the move because of climate change, refugees from drought or extreme weather or other climate impacts. Sense their fear and dislocation. Could know the adversity they'll face in finding a safe place to be. Contemplate and then be with whatever feeling arises. And now I'd invite you to call to mind that almost all governments and corporations are acting feebly, or not at all, or aggressively, or regressively in response to the climate crisis. What feelings or sensations arise as you contemplate that? cradling and being with whatever arises for you. Now I'd invite you to imagine a ravaged world, maybe 50 or 100 years down the road. Mass extinctions, climate wars, billions of people fleeing, mass starvation, the conditions for coherent human civilization destroyed. Your loved ones and their descendants will build an existence in this world. Imagining it, notice whatever sensation or feeling or energy arises in you and be with this. And finally, just feel yourself, your body, your goodness, your loves, your fears, you. How do you want to relate to this charnel ground of climate change? What does that feel like in your body? When you're ready, you could return to simple meditation, feeling your body breathing. Thank you. So So I'll talk for a while about charnel ground and practice and how we might relate to that as a collective or a community. So a charnel ground, for those who didn't read the blurb for the talk, is an above ground burial site. And so in Tibet, for example, where fuel was scarce for cremation, where the ground was frozen for much of the year, bodies would be ritually dismembered and left for the vultures. And so to be on a charnel ground is to be somewhere stark, dangerous, horrifying, chaotic. I was reading the account of a Western teacher who actually meditated on a charnel ground, perhaps in Nepal recently, and she was describing just the putrid reality of blood, bone, hair, limbs, corpses. And so the idea of charnel ground within Buddhist tradition and practice is that it is so real, so immediate, so intense that it just cuts through everything. So we might walk around with a sense that, yeah, my life's pretty good, 10% more of this, 40% less of that, got to take care of my health, but it's basically okay. Death's a long way away. The charnel ground just annihilates that. There's no escape, no bypassing, no salvation. Reality is undeniable. And so in this sense, the charnel ground as a real space is a support for our practice. It helps us to see, and also a test of our practice. What can we see? And so charnel grounds could be real places or circumstances, but they're also postures of mind, because in a sense, we're already on the charnel ground. You don't have to go to Tibet or Nepal. You could look out your window or walk down the street and be surrounded by suffering, samsara, all of the particular manifestations of that: racism, transphobia, xenophobia, mass incarceration, climate catastrophe, gendered harms, environmental devastation. We're on the charnel ground already. But most of us, much of the time, dissociate and dull and hide from at least some aspects of that stark reality. And so the notion of charnel ground is about how we can practice to allow our minds to open to painful realities. And so in a few minutes, I'll talk about charnel ground practice as presented by Pema Chodron in the Shambhala tradition. But first, I'll just name a bit of what I take to be the brute reality of climate change. I suspect that much of this you know, but it might be useful just to have this common reference point. And so one thing that's worth remembering is that climate disruption is not in the future, it's here. So we could look at many wars and refugee crises that are happening right now, many conflicts, for example, in Syria, refugees from Guatemala that relate to climate change. Every year where I live brings devastating fires, longer and longer fire seasons, floods, extreme weather that give us a foretaste of what even more extreme climate change might look like. Both drought and extreme weather are undercutting agricultural productivity, which we're beginning to feel where I live, and again, as a foretaste. We're also facing the movement of insects and insect-borne diseases in Alberta, British Columbia. It's especially spruce budworm that are happening because climates are warming and bugs have larger zones within which they can survive. And then parts of your own country may be becoming uninhabitable. We could think of shoreline property, for example. Every time there's a flood in Alberta, there's the question of, should we allow people to rebuild? And if you go to other parts of the world where there's less wealth for rebuilding or adaptation, where there's maybe more geographical vulnerability, there are much larger numbers of people, much starker situations of people having to leave their homes. So climate change is here. Another thing that's worth remembering or noticing is that greenhouse gases are very long-lived. And so we're currently experiencing about 1 degree of warming from pre-industrial times that comes from the accumulated carbon emissions of the Industrial Revolution and industrial society. So that's 1 degree so far. It seems likely that 2 degrees of warming is already locked in, given what's been emitted already. And then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that we have about 12 years to dramatically, radically decrease carbon emissions to have a chance of staying at 2 degrees. And the business as usual or modest action trajectory seems to be a 4-degree temperature rise by the end of the century. And so I've been reading this book, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. And he kind of spins out, what does a 4-degree temperature rise by the end of the century look like? And he's just basing this on IPCC reports and other mainstream science. And so we could consider 1 billion climate refugees, which is as many people as live in North and South America combined. Global economy shrinking by 30%, $600 trillion in climate damages, which is twice the total wealth that's in the world today. The equatorial band of the Earth, that part of our globe that's been so supportive of human life, would likely become uninhabitable. And then across the globe would be famine, heat waves, drought, crop failures, ocean flooding, and extreme weather. Just a couple of other things we can add to that cheery picture. One is the prospect of runaway climate change, that the anticipation is that at the moment, if we could dramatically reduce carbon emissions, we could affect the Earth's climate. But there will come a moment when natural feedback loops will actually be self-reinforcing enough to be beyond human intervention. So to take one of many, Earth is warming, permafrost is melting, melting permafrost releases methane. Methane is a very powerful, potent greenhouse gas. That leads to more warming, which leads to more permafrost melting, which leads to more methane. And that circle is something that humans would not be able to affect. And then the last thing we could add to the sense of the charnel ground of climate change is that mainly I've been talking about natural effects of temperature rise or temperature disruption, but we can reflect on how our political, social, cultural, economic systems respond to pressure. We could think, for example, of the Guatemalan refugees at the American border with Mexico. Part of that catastrophe is just people on the move, but part of the catastrophe is what we actually do as humans in the political and economic and social configurations that we're in when that pressure is applied, and it's not reassuring. So the IPCC predicts that twice as many wars will arise under a 4-degree scenario than currently. We can think about xenophobia and social division. We can think about political polarization. So all of that is the charnel ground of climate change. David Wallace Wells, many other climate journalists and activists are at pains to remind us that none of this is foreordained. We have agency, we have power. There's a lot of the story still to be written, and so we can affect how things play out. But as maybe a sidebar to this description of the charnel ground, I want to say a little bit about what's happened to collective agency or our ability to act together in our time. And so there are many charnel grounds, and they are all in a sense the same charnel ground. And so we could call this the charnel ground of neoliberalism. And so if we ask, why is climate change happening? It seems to me that any even moderately persuasive answer is going to focus us on the internal logic of complex human systems. We could talk about industrialization, colonization, capitalism, patriarchy, consumerism, and more. And so these are organized structures of human activity that have complex dynamics of their own. They have their own logics, which actually can be quite resistant to change. And these logics also shape us to our core. And so our identities, how we relate to our bodies, how we understand family and relationship, our way of interpreting time, what we strive for in life, how we understand ourselves, all of these and much more are profoundly shaped by the systems that dominate our world. We could talk about capitalism, for example, or patriarchy, shape us profoundly. But then one both damaging and mind-bending aspect of current dominant systems is that they tell us that the problem isn't the systems. The problem is you, the problem is me, the problem is each of us. And so in this story that I think many of us have absorbed very deeply, we as individuals need to work on ourselves. We need to adjust our lifestyles, we need to struggle with our weight, we need to learn to de-stress, we need to discipline ourselves, we need to knock some things off the to-do list, we need to get a different app for our to-do list. And if we just take responsibility as individuals, our problems would be lessened or solved. And this story of individual responsibility conveniently leaves out that the problems that we're supposed to solve by working on ourselves are actually predictable outcomes of the systems that condition our lives. So for example, you could try to deal with your sense of stress or speed by meditating or finding a better app for your to-do list. But in fact, you're stressed and speedy. I don't mean you and you and you, but just generalizing. Because of the ways our economy works, because of the ways our livelihoods might be very precarious, because of the ways our cities are built, where we spend a lot of time commuting, because of the ways that we're isolated by the kind of housing that we live in, the ways our neighborhoods work, resources are distributed in ways that make it very difficult to be a working person having your children cared for, et cetera, et cetera. Those are systemic effects. But the ideology of the system we're in says, David, get yourself together. If you were meditating more, if you were better organized, if you did this or that, it would be manageable. And I think that this kind of focus on individual responsibility for systemic problems we actually have very little agency in is a big part of our common sense about climate change. Why do you fly so much? Do you always remember to turn off the lights when you leave the room? Should you insulate your attic? Shouldn't you be eating less meat? There are 1,000 ways in which we're each meant to be responsible for climate change and for solving climate change. But in fact, I mean, it just seems plain to me from the scientific and social scientific evidence that if we have any chance at all of avoiding catastrophic climate change, it's going to be through massive systemic transformation. Thinking it can happen through personal lifestyle change is bullshit. What needs to happen is bold policy action, legislation, shifts in power relations, massive changes to economic systems, which isn't to say you shouldn't clean up your lifestyle. If you bike or walk instead of driving, you'll be healthier. If you become a vegan and hang out at the health food store, you might see something on the bulletin board that will let you go to a climate demo. Your vegan cooking class might unite you with people who could engage in activism together. So there are reasons to care about what we do individually, but it's mass mobilization and profound systemic transformation that's going to make the difference in climate outcomes. And so this is really important to remember. And I'll get to the charnel ground and the Dharma in a moment. But just this way in which we tend to be systematically deceived about the changes needed to mitigate climate disruption and to adapt to it. And so we're very strongly conditioned by the messages we get, by the media we read, by many of the beliefs of our society. We're conditioned to be confused and dulled and focused on our survival and focused on what's close at hand, isolated, forlorn, helpless, angry, addicted. These aren't personal failings. They're actually very predictable products of the very systems that are leading us to climate catastrophe. So that's my little snapshot of the charnel ground of climate change. And so what does Buddhism, what does Shambhala tell us about how to be on a charnel ground? About how to really see and feel what's there so that we can orient our activity toward the world as it is. And here I'm going to draw on Pema Chodron, her book, When Things Fall Apart. And in that book, she points to 3 traditional ways of practicing on the charnel ground. And those are ceasing struggle, using poison as medicine, and seeing all that arises as enlightened energy. And so the first one is ceasing struggle. And this is what we do when we simply meditate, do shamatha vipassana meditation. So we're confronted by some painful reality. It might just be the painful reality of our agitation as we sit to meditate, or it could be the painful reality of some social phenomenon. And we train ourselves to let the storylines go, to drop concepts, to stop struggling against what's there, to drop judgment, and just to feel it. In a sense, it's what we are doing as we contemplate it. And so we just feel what's there, experience what's there without making reality into the enemy. And so that's the first element of charnel ground practice, as Pema Chodron presents these traditional teachings, ceasing struggle. And I suspect that many of us who are listening to this have felt the power of that as a way of touching reality in our own meditation practice. So we cease struggle. Poison is medicine. So for those of you, Yana, ceasing struggle has a Hinayana flavor. Using poison as medicine has a Mahayana flavor. So here we're treating everything we encounter as to wake up. And the emphasis here is waking up to compassion, finding openness in ourselves, feeling kinship with all suffering beings. And so in using poison as medicine, we're learning to use what's painful to cultivate genuine caring about other beings. And it's not even developing care as a project. The view is that as we learn to be directly with reality, directly with our own being and body, dropping storylines, something actually very naturally arises from that space that is compassionate, caring, in kinship and solidarity with others. And then the third element of charnel ground practice as presented by Pema Chodron is seeing all that arises as enlightened energy. So this is perhaps the more Vajrayana tantric element of it. So here we're practicing experiencing reality beyond the dualisms of good and bad, us and them, pure and impure. And so we come to see the world and experience the world right there on the charnel ground as sacred. The charnel ground itself is sacred. The emergency room, the natural disaster, the mess of our lives is sacred. And so it's not that we're on the charnel ground and thinking, how do I escape this? How do I save myself from this? But actually this seeing all that arises as enlightened energy is being liberated into reality, into a sense of the fundamental wholeness and sacredness of things as they are. And the suggestion is that with these 3 charnel ground practices, with learning to see and feel and let in what's real, we're actually becoming ready to act skillfully and compassionately to help others. That somehow this transformation of our experience of charnel ground gives us a sense of the real possibility that's there. There's this open freedom from which we could really generate something new, from which we could really do something interesting. And so those are traditional teachings from Buddhism, from Shambhala, about how to train to actually let in painful realities and how to act in the world from a stark sense of what's real. And so I love these teachings. I find them wise, but I'm also a guy who just resigned as Shastri and left Shambhala. And I think it's important to really ask, and we could use Shambhala as an example, but there are doubtless many others. But here's a community that has steeped in these practices for decades. That's all about these practices of opening to reality, of opening to others, of breaking down barriers, of seeing what's real. It's in the membership pamphlet, right? It's our whole project. And yet, I think we can ask, and we can ask it of the charnel ground of climate change, we can ask it of sexual harms, we can ask it of white supremacy, as these manifest in Shambhala. To what extent have we actually, as a community, let reality in? Who in our community and organization have been awake to the stark reality of the world around us? And I was kind of ruefully thinking today that, so I teach at a university. It's a very mainstream neoliberal university. It's not an exemplar of anything awake or deeply spiritual or in touch with reality. But with that said, my university, rough number, is 100 times more climate aware and active than Shambhala as an organization. I'd say my conventional neoliberal university has way better sexual politics and definitely better sexual assault policies than Shambhala as an organization. I'd say that my university, conventional and mainstream as it is doing way more to challenge white dominance and settler colonialism than Shambhala as an organization. So I just wanted to point to this question of, we have these profound practices. They're about opening to reality. They're about acting skillfully to relieve the suffering of beings. But we could actually reflect in a self-critical way about what evidence there is that as deep practitioners in Shambhala, we may have done a limited amount to actually be responsive to these social, political, environmental realities around us. And so in the last part of this talk, I want to revisit the charnel ground practices that are talked about by Pema Chodron with a bit more of a collective and political lens. And here I offer this tentatively and as incomplete thinking, but I think it would be interesting to talk about. And so Buddhism is, of course, collective from the start. The third jewel is Sangha. Shambhala is all about society, culture, ceremony. That's in the membership pamphlet too. But as different radicals within Shambhala point to and remind us again and again, and in their number, and these are dear friends, I'd include Shante Smalls, who brought together this series, we're reminded that the pathological systems that surround us shape us deeply. They shape what we can see, they shape what we can feel, they shape what we can let in, they shape what we have language for. And so I think it's worth asking, what would it mean to feel collectively into the realities of climate change and of many other systemic harms that surround us? And what would it then be to respond deliberately and collectively in ways that are informed by our spiritual tradition, our meditative practice, and that actually challenge what needs to be challenged in the harmful systems that surround us? And so I'll just mention two convictions I have and then bring it back to Pema Chodron and those three ways of practicing on the charnel ground. So a first conviction of mine that I'll share is that in being deeply shaped by these systems around us, how we're shaped depends on where we stand, especially in terms of power relations and where we are in power relations. And so this means that to understand reality, we have to build a picture from different perspectives. And so the systems around us condition us not to see, condition us not to have a coherent picture, condition us to believe the stories that hold harms and privileges in place that allow climate destruction to continue. And the people who see the most of this are often those who are excluded or marginalized to the point where they can't or won't believe the prevailing stories. And so there's a particular insight that can come from being the person excluded, marginalized, or harmed. You can see things about the system that those who are comfy don't see. And so this first conviction is that we need to build knowledge of reality by bringing marginalized voices to the center of our conversations and our decision-making. We need to see the limitations of our view, especially if we live with relative privilege, and to learn from folks inside and outside our community who don't have that same standpoint or that same privilege. So that's the first conviction. Then the second one, which we'll go into more in a few minutes, is that we learn by acting. So this isn't just about dialogue and contemplation and reflection. It's about acting to challenge and change systems. And that action itself shows us how reality works. And so with that bit of framing, let me return to Pema Chodron and these traditional charnel ground practices, and to think, well, what more might we see of these from the standpoint of how we're shaped by systems and what it takes to learn about systems. And so the first of her therapies for being on the charnel ground is ceasing struggle, feeling beneath the storyline, dropping judgment. And so for me to introduce a bit of politics or a sense of systems into this is that the stories we drop need to include dominant storylines. Maybe they're capitalist or neoliberal or consumerist or white supremacist or whatever they are. We have imbibed and inherited and taken on these dominant storylines. If we're comfortable in the system, we may never have found reason to challenge them or the energy to challenge them. And so here there is this need to listen to those who are marginalized and harmed, or even just differently situated within systems. But the ceasing struggle piece relates to the fact that part of our conditioning is to resist non-dominant stories. We could go very quickly when someone challenges our received view of the world to defensiveness or guilt or immobilization or anger. And this is actually true of stories of climate disruption in my experience. I live in Alberta, home of the oil sands, the tar sands, so maybe this is especially prominent in places like this. But people get really pissed off if you start to tell a different story about climate change. And I find I myself can get pretty antsy when my own received wisdom about climate change is challenged. And so ceasing struggle is a crucial capacity if we're going to allow others and allow ourselves to see the limits of inherited storylines. Strong emotions will arise when we're called on something, when some limitation of our view is pointed out. And this therapy that Pema Chodron communicates so powerfully in her work of dropping storyline and being gently with the feelings is very powerful in that context, as a political act, as an ethical act. And there's actually a whole current of radical environmental writing, contemplative environmental writing, that's about getting beneath the storyline and feeling what's real, learning from our reactivity to environmental devastation. Joanna Macy famously works on this. Adrienne Marie Brown is another person who I found powerful talking about this. And so ceasing struggle could mean just learning to be with our grief and our disbelief and our mourning. That could lead us to turn away from harsh environmental realities. And this is something that's going to happen with others. So here I'm treating ceasing struggle not just as a solitary meditative technique, but as a collective practice of inquiry, and one that brings in differences of perspective. And it seems to me that this collective practice of being in communication, recognizing our reactivity, and pacifying that is a really powerful way of getting out of some of the echo chambers we may be in as a predominantly white, predominantly privileged Dharma community in Shambhala. And to me, it's very applicable to the charnel ground of climate change. And I'd love to talk about this in the discussion period. What shape is this taking in the world, in the Shambhala world around you? What shape could it take? Who would we need to be in conversation with to see the reality of climate change, to feel our reactivity, to train ourselves to not struggle against what's real? And what would we need to do to encounter climate reality outside of the safe space of our Shambhala centers, our habitual practices? So that's ceasing struggle. The second technique that Pema Chodron talked about was using poison as medicine. So here we learn to let in what's real and let it awaken our compassion rather than putting us to sleep. And what I notice in my own conditioning is that it's actually very hard to hold the harsh reality of climate change in view for very long. I just need to dull out or change the subject or post a good post on Facebook to show that I care about climate change and then let it go. And so we could ask, what are the conditions for letting the charnel ground, including the charnel ground of climate change, wake us up? What would allow us to feel the reality that the world is losing its capacity to support human life, and to let this awaken our compassion rather than put us into hiding? What would allow us to feel the reality, the starkness of climate impacts that are affecting others much more than they're affecting us right now? And rather than going into some defensive crouch, actually let this awaken our solidarity with others. What would it take, and I was experiencing some of this in the contemplation, to really feel the fragility of our bodies and the intensity of the forces we've awakened through industrialization and carbon emissions, and to, in that vulnerability, feel it as a connection to others rather than something we need to hunker down with. And I think that here too, our practice needs to be in conversation with others across differences, and it needs to involve learning through action. And so there is the moment of discussion and reflection, but there also needs to be a going out and acting with others. And in my experience, which has included sitting at my desk thinking about climate change a lot and has involved moments of activism and social action, it's definitely in those moments of social action, trying to shift systems, trying to make a difference, that I've actually been able to feel compassion and solidarity most firmly. And, you know, if we think about an organization like Shambhala, some of those moments of action might involve a centralized decision, a policy, a new rule, a new protocol. But if I envision within Shambhala climate action with others across difference that really teaches us, that really awakens something new, I imagine also very decentralized action, things happening within this Shambhala center or that household, this really kind of experimental proliferation of possibilities that awakens compassionate energy. And then finally, there's the technique of, or the fruition of, seeing all that arises as enlightened energy, the third element that Pema Chodron talks about. So here we, through our practice, through opening, see the wholeness and sacredness of the world as it is. And we see that beyond blame, beyond aggression, beyond the dualism of good and bad. And from that place, possibility arises, energy arises, creativity arises. And here as well, in my experience, that energetic, innovative possibility, that sense of the sacredness of our activity, the sacredness of the world we're active in, comes through collective doing. Some kind of sense of alignedness, being with the flow, rightness. And so I think that there too, if we can find ways to make it our practice, to act, to change systems, to do that with a humility about what we know and a recognition of how much we have to learn from others who are differently situated, who are less privileged by the systems that are tearing this world apart. Action that even prefigures the kind of world that we want. I think that that's where this enlightened energy most arises. And so I've offered a picture of climate change as a charnel ground. And we can be on a charnel ground. We are on a charnel ground and hide, shut down, react, feel hopeless, feel isolated, feel angry. Or through practices like those I've described, we can actually soften, experience reality, including the brutal reality of what awaits us, our children, our loved ones. In the face of climate change, we can soften to that. We can feel compassion and solidarity arise, and we can feel the sense of sacredness and wholeness that enables effective action. And so I'll stop there, and I would love to hear your perspectives, your questions, and we have a bit of time left for that. We're a relatively small group, so please be brave speaking up or typing something in chat.
Hi, so I'm connected can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I'm connected to Buddhism by proximity. I'm not involved. But so the charnel ground is a really natural system that's kind of abhorrent to us, right? It's difficult. I can only imagine being there with the bodies that are dismembered and being eaten. But it's a really natural system. And so it's almost weird that we compare it to some of the charnel activities that we've created, racism or like patriarchy, because it seems like that's mean to the real charnel ground. Because there's nothing mean or antagonistic about the real charnel ground. It's just a natural system that's creepy because we don't like body parts. So that was a comment. And then my question was, I didn't understand. Do I cease to resist? And again, I don't have the Buddhist background that I need, perhaps. Do I cease to resist capitalism and racism and just accept that reality? Or I'm confused, because I thought the whole idea was to be more, not resistant, but to help change those things.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great observation and a great question. I mean, to the observation,
Okay.
I suppose that, I agree with you. Charnel ground, decomposition, scavengers, it just is. It's not good or bad. And from a certain perspective, human confusion, all of the pathologies built into the systems that have grown up around us, also just is. And so this in a way leads to my answer, and I think there's lots of room for lots of Buddhist debate and churning around it. But my answer to your question would be, at a certain level, we could drop our sense that someone must be to blame, something is out of joint, given the devastating environmental situation in our room. So there's in our world. So there's a kind of conventional, clenched, angry, who do I point the finger at, including me, attitude. And so the softening would be to let that element of things go and perceive what is. But a further part of the Buddhist understanding of social action, as I've learned it anyhow, is from that place of really just letting it in and being with it. There might arise, first of all, a natural desire to alleviate suffering. And also perhaps a sense of, I mean, I'm a systems thinker, so you might even say a sense of systemic understanding. Oh, that's what's going on. It's not that guy in the corner office who's the big villain, although he might be, but it's actually, we've constructed our world. Here are the causal flows and interrelationships that leave us in this shitty and frightening situation. Here's how I could actually step in and be useful. And so it's not passivity. It's not quiescence. It's not what is, I'm just going to sit here and meditate. It actually can be passionate activism, but one that comes from real understanding rather than a kind of more conventional us and them, who do I blame stance that, you know, and I think we can talk about environmental activism as containing instances of this that often leads to more of the same, that often leads to more suffering and doesn't actually find that pressure point where we could really shift something. And so I've been reading, I'll forget the title unless I pick it up, this book by Charles Eisenstein called Climate, A New Story, where he really runs with that, where he says, what would it look like to grapple with climate change in a way that doesn't just replicate the aggression that has given us climate change and the division that has given us climate change. So I welcome more from you, but that's what I find to say.
Okay, that was useful. That was useful. Just don't get angry, get useful.
Well, or be angry and useful,
okay.
But there are forms of anger that actually shut out information.
Yes.
And there might be a righteous anger that has to do with seeing what's actually happening and grieving it and feeling an energy arise that could actually go somewhere useful. Okay. I'm not anti-anger. I don't actually think that Buddhism is anti-anger. I think that including in the Shambhala tradition, there's this sense that there's wisdom in all of our energies. And our work is to uncover that wisdom rather than acting habitually.
Okay, that's useful. Thank you.
So I see a couple of questions typed in. One is, as a parent, can you talk about how to discuss this brutal topic with kids? I struggle with this a lot. I have a 10-year-old, and he wanted to sit on the bed as I gave this talk, and I thought, I don't know if that would be skillful. And so, I mean, speaking just from my own experience, and this is obviously calibrated to ages and personalities, but kids know more than we give them credit for, and I think have more resilience than we give them credit for. And I think that there's a wisdom in the charnel ground teachings that could apply to communication with kids as much as it applies to our own navigation of these issues ourselves, which is that shutting intensity out often comes back to bite us. And so I think if we can stabilize our own minds and not be in reactivity ourselves in dealing with climate change, do that work, then I think we can share in a matter-of-fact way some of what we're facing, why it's scary, what can be done, what we could do in our household, why we might go to a demonstration together. At 10, at least, that sounds or feels to me like the most skillful thing I can do. And I choose my moments and try and not just make it a speech, but a conversation. But I don't know how quickly things are going to go south in terms of the world my 10-year-old will grow up in. But I think a lot about what are the practical skills and forms of resilience and forms of emotional being that will equip him to live in a world that will be much more challenging and less hospitable, I suspect, than the one that I've lived in. And so I think all of that could come into how we discuss this with our kids. And I welcome more from you, reaction or your own perspective, typed or spoken on that. So feel free to come back in, but I'm looking at another question. How can we move the culture of Shambhala or Western Buddhism in general to a more inclusive framework so that the charnel grounds of climate change and other harms can be addressed by all, not just a white privileged point of view? Yeah, such a rich question. I mean, this in some ways will harken back to the talk by Arti Tajuja and things that have woven through some of the other talks in this series. Sometimes, and I've in the last couple of years have been quite involved in conversations on social action, inclusion, white awareness in Shambhala. Others have been doing that work for a much longer time. But sometimes the sensibility, the very way of holding that question about how do we shift our culture so it's more inclusive, imagines that we have this rich offering, and it's a shame that folks who aren't white and a bit older and middle class on the whole, it's a shame that those folks can't experience it. So how do we bring them in so that they too can enjoy the fruits of Shambhala and all of our tools for being with what's real? But in fact, it's in large part, it seems to me that it's the other way around. That I'm not sure where we offer benefit, where we just ask for forbearance from folks who are coming into our centers who are not well represented there, or folks who aren't coming into our centers or who we're relating to. I'm not sure. What I'm surest of is that the only way for us to touch reality is to be in humble conversation with folks who aren't around in large numbers in our center. So we've been in this bubble talking again and again about our compassionate engagement with reality, when in fact there's a delusion there. And so how do we change that culture? I think that there are things we can do here and now within the Shambhala organization, within a given Shambhala center, to say, whose voice has been pushed to the margins again and again, despite our goodwill, despite our best intentions perhaps, and how can we give prominence to that voice? And that's a dicey thing because people don't always like being singled out as the person we need to hear from now. That can be very unskillful. And so a counterpart to that, and this is what the White Awareness Council of Shambhala has been doing, for example, is reflecting on what work could be done among the privileged folks who are well represented to unlearn some of our patterns so that we can actually be decent conversation partners with the people we may be realizing we need to hear from. So I think, first step is just recognizing how limited our community and our perspective has been, not pretending that we haven't been complicit in reiterating harmful patterns that exist in the society around us as well. Sexual harm, racialized harm, class-based harm, we could go on. So recognizing that gap and destructiveness, and then looking for the resources we need. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, it will be hard for Shambhala to undo patterns only from within Shambhala. And luckily, whether we're talking about climate change or environmental justice or white supremacy or patriarchy, there are probably hundreds of organizations in my own city that have been doing this work for years or decades, and who have trainings and who have speakers and who have methodologies. And so part of it is also being less insular and self-satisfied as a Dharma community, and realizing that actually we need to learn from folks who are not in Shambhala and may not need to be in Shambhala. And so building those conversations and networks and partnerships in ways that come in very humbly and make the coffee, carry the picket signs, and begin to build our capacity and stretch our minds that way. So again, I welcome your coming back in with that, but that's what first comes to me. Other reflections, questions, observations? Maybe I'll say just one more thing about this question of how we shift the culture in Shambhala. And it could be talked about in many contexts, but I'll talk about it specifically around climate change. So what I've suggested is the overwhelming tendency in many of us is to shut a lot of information out because it just feels too overwhelming, to feel helpless, to feel demoralized. And for me, some of the remedy, which I was trying to connect to these charnel ground teachings, is actually finding places of action, which often will be in partnership and solidarity with folks who are not in Shambhala. And what I think would be very helpful for us as a community, and I realize there's a lot else happening and a lot of resources strained, but I feel like as someone who's interested in environmental and climate issues and have been within Shambhala, I know about a fraction of the initiatives and experiments and hard lessons that have been learned in other places within the big Shambhala community. And so I think we shift our gaze from what does head office tell us we need to do to here we are in Edmonton, what could we be doing ourselves in relation to environmental responsibility, climate activism, understanding the systems that shape it. But we need to learn as a larger community from that experimentation. And so what are the modes of sharing and communication that could actually allow me as someone in Edmonton saying, we seem to rely on air travel a whole lot to do our practice or to bring in teachers. What have people been experimenting with here and there, and what have they learned? And so just that sharing of experimentation, sharing of lessons, here's someone in Seattle who could actually hold my hand a bit as I get this difficult thing started. Here's someone in Vancouver who knows something about how to actually reflect and evaluate as we go. And so how do we build those horizontal networks of learning and sharing and mentoring that could support us not only in shifting culture, but in shifting activity? Any last questions or thoughts that you want to say or type? Shall I turn it back to you, Adriana?
Thank you, David. Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you. Um, that reminds what you just said about the centers themselves. It reminds me a lot of mayoral networks and how they work on a city level in terms of collaborating and collectively accumulating knowledge rather than depending on larger state or governmental systems to indicate what they should do. But yeah, thank you so much for such a rich and important and relevant talk for tonight. For those of you who join live, if you'd like to watch this talk again at any point, because it is recorded, you can find it via your My Programs tab, via your Shambhala Online account. It'll be there within the next 24 hours or so. For those of you who would like to join for upcoming talks, our next weekly Dharma gathering is with David Perrin for a talk titled, I Love You and I Might Not Like You, Metta as a Liberatory Practice, which should be great. So yes, thank you everyone who joined live tonight. Thank you to everyone who will be listening to this recording at another time. Please spread the word about this series. This is open to all students, regardless of affiliation, tradition, community. There's a really big emphasis on bringing teachers and topics to the series that are particularly socially, culturally, politically relevant to the context and time that we are in right now. And having this online platform and having these talks recorded is really a way for us to be able to share these teachings and our collective wisdom all together. So thank you so much, David. Thank you everyone that has joined, and have a beautiful rest of your evening.
Thanks everyone.